It's time to join Montana's very own and your voice for agriculture, Talkin' Ag Lane Nordland, for today's Lanecast.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to more agriculture conversations here on the Lanecast Ag Podcast in conjunction with the Western Ag Network. Thank you for joining us, whether that is on our video podcast platforms or on our audio podcasts as well. And I tell you what, friends, it has been a tough go the past few summers for so many farmers and ranchers across parts of Montana and the surrounding states with the plague that is grasshoppers. These little critters have been impacting our yields on our grain crops and, of course, on our pasture lands. And the big question is, what is 2023 going to be like? Well, we can talk about it at the bar, at the cafe, or at our home kitchen tables. But until we know exactly what's going on, that's just talk. So that's why we're going to be bringing in one of those experts that follows the grasshopper trends, the hatches, and whatnot. We're joined today by Gary Adams. He is the State Plant Health Director for Montana with USDA APHIS and PPQ. Gary, how are things going for you here today?
Things are good. It's a good spring day. We're waiting for the rains this later this week, so today's all right. Yep.
Well, we were lucky enough to have a little bit of rain here at our place in north central Montana here this morning. The sun's finally peeking out a little bit to help this grass grow. But, Gary, as I mentioned, grasshoppers have been on the minds of so many producers, and they've been devastating. I mean, they've eaten crops. I've seen pictures. I've personally seen it. They're eating the bark off of trees, the enamel off of T-posts, eating leather in our tack rooms on our saddles and gear. And it's put a lot of producers in pretty tough spots. But first off, I know you've been traveling the state and talking with producers. What are we really going to be looking at here over the next year in terms of what the grasshoppers will look like in the coming weeks? Did the moisture and cold weather impact what that hatch may be? I guess I'll kind of give you the floor. What is the outlook for this year, Gary?
I'll start with saying I don't know. However, in 2019 we had a pretty cool, wet spring, and I thought we were going to be scot-free as far as grasshoppers, because previous to that they hadn't been very bad, but that just promoted enough grass growth for them to really populate. And in the following two or 3 years that we've had a lot of drought, they just were real impactful. So the cool wet spring that we've had so far isn't really going to tell us too much. In 2022, my agency APHIS does a rangeland grasshopper survey statewide to try to determine how many adult grasshoppers are out there that could lay eggs that could hatch the following year, which would be this year. And it still looks like we have a pretty significant amount of grasshoppers throughout Montana. It kind of moves where they're bad. A few years ago, they're in different places, and some places it's the same. But we really won't know what the outlook is going to be like until we start watching, starting in June, probably anytime after Memorial Day. We'll start seeing what's hatching, and I would expect that we could still have a significant number of grasshoppers in 2023, but we won't know until we see the lights of their eyes, so to speak.
Now, Gary, as we look at that, though, from last year's kind of projections on, and maybe let's share how we count from the previous year based on what those projections could be, and maybe jump into what some of those hotspots, where those hotspots might be, where treatments occurred, where treatments didn't occur, in terms of trying to prevent those grasshoppers from laying eggs. Let's maybe just shed a little light on that aspect of it.
So I pulled up another slide here that just talks about the life cycle of the grasshoppers. And if you know how butterflies mature, they are a caterpillar at one part of their life stage, and then they go into a cocoon or a chrysalis and come out looking like a whole different critter. But grasshoppers are grasshopper from start to finish, and they look like a grasshopper. So it's incomplete metamorphosis. And so starting in late May to early June, they'll hatch, and they're these little tiny little guys about the size of a grain of rice. And that's really where I suggest that producers be out there looking, starting anytime after Memorial Day, and to keep looking because they'll hatch over a period of time. But they'll go through what we call 5 instars or 5 life stages, and what they do is they shed their exoskeleton, which will be important if we start talking about some treatment methods. And then they get a little bigger, and then they harden up again. So each one of these life stages, they shed their outside, and then they grow a little bigger, and then they harden up again until they become an adult and start laying eggs. So I think one of your questions was, how do we survey for them, right?
Yep.
I have a hour-long PowerPoint, which I don't want to bore you with, but I have some. I'm not sure exactly where that slide is. I got to find it. So how we do a survey. So bear with me here for a second. Not sure where it is. So here's exactly how that does work. So we survey for the number of grasshoppers per square yard, and that's kind of our designation on populations out there. So we'll visualize a square foot in front of us, and then we'll walk towards that square foot, and we'll count the number of grasshoppers that jump out of it. If they jump in and jump back out, they don't count. They have to be there to begin with. So, and then we write that down and we repeat that 18 times. So you total up that number and you'll have the total number of grasshoppers in 18 square feet, which if you divide that by 2 is 9 square feet, which is a square yard. So that's how we do it. So you want a representative sample of the entire area. So you do a big horseshoe shape out through rangeland. These are rangeland surveys, not cropland surveys. You could do the same surveys in cropland, but that's how we survey for them, and we determine that. I have another slide here somewhere, but anywhere 8 and above could be economically impactful to the rangeland out there. We generally, our agency doesn't recommend treatments until you start seeing the teens or more in the yard. And I know there's places that have been 40, 50 for grasshoppers per yard, which is some of those scenarios you talked about where they eat everything and then they start going for the shovel handles in the tack room. So
yeah,
anything in the teens per square yard is pretty impactful, and you maybe could benefit from some suppression activities. What were the other questions you asked? I want to make sure I get them.
Well, I guess when we look at that, before we maybe discuss what the treatment options are, when's the best time, maybe let's look at what the results from last year's survey look like. What are some of those hot spots that we can possibly expect once the hatch starts there at the end of May, moving into June, and just so producers, I think producers know if it's going to be there just based off of last year, and then maybe we could parallel how treatment really benefited some other areas of the state when that application took place. But I guess, what are some of those hotspot predictions?
Could you pull the screen share off of there so you don't have to see me zip through a bunch of slides, and I'll find some maps for you here. You figure out where they are. It's down the way over here in my PowerPoint. So I'll say a couple of things while I'm trying to find the maps. Is that my agency conducts some programs, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, and those programs in 2021 were significant. We treated quite a number of acres, but we're we're only one outfit that's treating out there. A lot of private landowners are treating on their own without our assistance. You can bring up my PowerPoint again now if you like. And so what we do is this adult survey every year. And again, it's only on rangeland. We don't look at cropland, and it's only a snapshot. So we'll drive down the road between 6 and 10 miles, and we'll stop and get out and try to count grasshoppers, and then we'll get back in and drive down the road. So there may be some hot spots that we miss, or maybe we may not see the whole picture. It's just a snapshot in time, and a week later it could be a different story because they move in and out. So I'll just go through this really quick. So in 2017, we did this survey, and this is what it looked like. This is what we predicted 2018 would be. And then in 2018, we did a survey again, and it was pretty accurate. But then we predicted what was going to happen in 2019. But if you remember at the beginning of the interview, I talked about how 19 was a cool, wet spring, and we thought we were out of it. And then the grasshoppers hatched late. There was plenty for them to eat, and then it went into a drought period. Well, they loved that. So in 2019, you started seeing all the red and orange areas are areas where there's a significant population of grasshoppers. So orange is above 8 per yard, and red would be above 15 per yard. And you can see throughout parts of the state that they were starting to grow. And we predicted what was going to happen in 2020. And again, remember that what we count in one fall doesn't necessarily predict what's going to happen the next summer. And in 2020, it really exploded throughout eastern Montana in particular. So that was a big year. That's when people really started calling. My agency did some treatments. Private landowners did treatments on their own. Again, our program is just a rangeland program. We don't treat cropland, and except for a few circumstances. And then in 2021, we predicted what was going to happen in 2022, or 2021. This is where it ended at 2021, but we did quite a bit of treatment down here in the southeastern part of the state, in particular, a tiny bit up here in Phillips County. But you can see that it's still, this is after the treatment period. This is when we were counting grasshoppers in late summer, not when we treated. And so in Phillips County, they persisted there. And then part of the issue was that we had a plan to do some treatments in Phillips County. But if you remember, back in that year, they had a series of 104, 105 degree days in June, which is not normal. And it stopped the growth of all their grass. And so they made the decision that there wasn't anything to save there. They needed to save that money they would use for treatments to purchase hay or what have you. They actually sold off a lot of cattle. The extension agent, who's no longer up there, indicated that half of the cattle in Phillips County was actually sold off that year, at the end of that year, because of the lack of forage that was available. But some of these other areas where we had treated, in 2020, we treated in this blue spot right here. You can see the population's a little bit lower. Still some grasshoppers throughout Powder River County, but it was lower than what it was the previous year. And then last year, if you start looking at some of our treatments, this blue is down in Wyoming where they did a lot of treatments, but you can also see where the populations did start to decrease in some of these areas where we did some treatments. We did no treatments in Custer County, and they started to explode. And in Garfield County, we had a lot of complaints up through the Fort Peck Reservation. Anyway, this survey, this map that you're looking at right now is a survey that we did through mid-July through August of 2022, and this is where we predict grasshoppers to be next year. Now, I say this with a grain of salt because I did get calls early last year all along the Rocky Mountain front, over in here, maybe, which is close to where you are, from people that had isolated spots, and we may or may not have picked up those populations when we did our roadside adult surveys, but we did go out and do some surveys on behalf of those landowners when they called, and we let them know what they had. So again, this is just a snapshot in time, but I think your original question is, what's it going to look like this coming year? We still expect that there's some populations where it's red here, where you could still see some significant populations in the future. Here you see a big green dip here. This is a lot of that's the Fort Belknap Reservation, where we did do some treatments in 2021, and the populations were lower. But a lot of private landowners did their own treatments independent of anything that the USDA did, and that does have an impact as well.
So, and again, these are estimates, they're predictions. We understand that aspect of things as well. And when we look at that, obviously that could throw off the bell curve in a positive manner, possibly with that the private application that landowners were doing as well. So are we expecting that it could be a little bit lower actual year for grasshoppers in certain parts of the state? But because I do know for sure in between Belt and Great Falls, where we're located, we had a lot of grasshoppers show up last year, and it impacted range conditions quite a bit. Could we see more of that over in this region where there wasn't a lot of past preventative measures put into place, and kind of in the red over there in eastern Montana? I guess that's a question everybody's going to be thinking about here for the next few weeks.
Well, it's interesting. You said between Belt and Great Falls, and for those familiar with Montana, that's in here, and that didn't show up as anything red in there. But you're telling me that there was a lot of grasshoppers, so that's a good indicator where we're not this map isn't a perfect situation. But my answer to that is that yes, I would. There are years where I would sit back in my chair and do other things that my agency does, because grasshoppers really is only one little thing, and I would say that there is a significant potential for there to be continued grasshopper populations in 2023. So yeah, any place where there's red, you're talking about some places over in here where we didn't show that it's orange or red, but you're saying there was a lot, and I believe you. I know that there's places where this map doesn't indicate that the populations are high, and some people are going to say, well, we had a cold winter and we had a lot of snow. And my answer to that is that grasshoppers have been around way longer than we have, and they're used to Montana winters, and snowpack and snow cover are really just an insulator for the soil. They don't let that cold get down to the soil, and there's a lot of snow cover. And so if there was any of that, then I don't think you should expect that the winter had a significant impact on the eggs, because they're pretty tough. And the trick is really to get out there in the spring and June and to monitor what's happening early, so that you don't wait until the grasshoppers are adults and laying eggs again. If you want to manage them, you do it in a timely manner and not wait until it's too late. And once they're laying eggs, it's, in my opinion, it's pretty tough to manage them at that point.
Now, obviously, forecasts for the rest of the summer, some forecasters are saying that the weather could heat up and our moisture could also go away with that. And we've had such a wet spring so far this year. In the past, the longer that this cooler, wet season during spring is, could that have a bigger impact when the hot, dry weather comes here in the next few months, and the cause and the impact that'll have on that rangeland and the grasshoppers coming out? Because obviously they would just stay dormant a little longer. That's what I'm assuming. Could we see quite an impact on those rangeland conditions if this spring kind of delays the hatch?
Well, that's kind of what happened in 2019, is that the hatch was delayed. There was a lot of moisture. The grass growth was significant. When the grasshoppers did hatch late, they were less noticeable because there was enough forage to share between the cattle and the wildlife and the grasshoppers. So there wasn't a lot of treatments that occurred, and therefore they all flourished and laid a lot of eggs. And then the following year, when there was significant drought, then we had the real explosion of grasshoppers in 2020. So that could happen. If the continued spring moisture continues after the grasshoppers hatch, there is potential for that to be a good situation where fungal growth and diseases that move naturally through the grasshopper population could do that, and it'll eventually have a natural crash in the population. We humans are not going to control things on a large basis. We're going to manage maybe some forage on a localized basis, but Mother Nature is really going to have to take care of it. So moisture and heat later after the hatch of the grasshoppers could really impact the population, but that remains to be seen. We'll only know that happens when it happens. And I wish I could do a better prediction of that, but I simply can't.
Well, and with that though, you talked about there in 2019, there was a lot of grass at that point during part of that growing season, so we didn't see a lot. There wasn't a lot of treatment, and some of our viewers and listeners may be wondering, how do we treat? What does that process look like, especially when we're working with USDA APHIS or wanting to go out and do an application by yourself? When is the best time? Is there funding available to do these treatments? Who do we reach out to? Is it too late? Is it too early? Could you walk us through that, Gary?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about the USDA program, and it's a cooperative program with the landowners, and the funding in the past was sufficient enough to do some treatments. Last year we didn't do anything because limited funding. This year there's a little bit of funding. We don't know exactly how much, but it's really distributed throughout the entire western U.S. and Montana being kind of farther north and a little bit later as grasshoppers emerge. It's kind of hard to tell what's going to remain when it comes time to do some treatment, but there is some funding available. Again, our treatment is very specific, so we do encourage others to take action on their own if necessary. And if you go back to the Dust Bowl era, when an individual farmer, I don't know if you saw some old pictures of those spreaders, and they're trying to spread out arsenic, and they might kill a few grasshoppers with throwing stuff out by hand, and then they just get reinfested. It was determined that the federal government could play a role when requested to coordinate large areas of treatment to prevent reinfestation, so that if it's big enough that the treatment will sustain that suppression activity and not just get reinfested. So if there's an area of primarily rangelands, so it's only a rangeland program, of 10,000 acres or more, that you should just call me, and we'll put my contact information up here at the end, or you can share it. And we'll try to have a meeting or discussion with you and your landowners, to your neighbors, to try to figure out if the program is going to work for you. And if the funding's available and we can get a program together and it meets with the requirements, then we will pay 1/3 of the total cost of the treatment of private acres. If the federal land managing agency, if you have a federal land that's involved there, if they also request us and there's funding available, we cover that on behalf of that land managing agency. So that's up to them to ask us. So we don't do anything unless we're asked. I know there's some concerns out there about us treating over areas, and that was private land, but we wouldn't treat anywhere where there isn't a request to treat. It has to meet within the requirements. We deal with the Endangered Species Act. We have environmental assessments that have just been completed about the different treatment types. But what we with APHIS like to do is to treat using diflubenzuron, which is a certain type of pesticide that prevents. Remember when I talked about the life stages of the grasshoppers? It prevents when it goes from one life stage to another. It prevents the formation of that exoskeleton. So it's very specific to arthropods with grasshoppers, anything with an exoskeleton. That's very specific to things that eat it. So adult honeybees are generally not even affected by it because they're not going to shed their exoskeleton anymore. So we try to use only that pesticide to the extent possible. Mic goes out on me. And that requires us to treat early, which is before the 4th of July. So 4th of July is kind of pushing it in Montana, depending on the weather. If it's a cool spring, it might go a little beyond that. But really from mid-June through the 4th of July, that 3-week period is really the time where diflubenzuron really is going to work, because you want to get them when the grasshoppers are still going to go through other life stages and then die because they don't make their exoskeleton anymore. So what it does is it prevents chitin, which is what makes their exoskeletons hard. And birds don't have chitin, people don't have chitin, fish don't have chitin, cows don't have chitin. So it's pretty environmentally friendly. Other arthropods could be affected by it, but what we do to mitigate the risk of that is we only treat every other swath. We don't blanket treat anymore like we used to. So what that does is leave about half of the area untreated, and you rely on the grasshoppers to move back and forth in the environment into a treated swath. That's why you got to get it early so they have time to get there before they're an adult. And really all we're trying to do is suppress those numbers, because grasshoppers are an important part of the ecosystem. Other organisms rely on them, birds. And so we just suppress them down to where they're not going to eat you out of house and home, and keep them, we want to keep them out there. We're not eradicating them. I know there's people who would like to see all grasshoppers go away, but that's not our intent. That's not what what we're trying to do. So we suppress them, then we use the rats as reduced age and area treatments, which means we skip the swaths. We use diflubenzuron. We try to get it done in June. I think those are your questions. The question to your landowners is get out there and scout early. Again, anytime starting in late May, but because it's kind of a cooler spring this year, I would say start looking in June. And if you go out one day and you don't see much, go out a week again later, because they continue to hatch over time. And they don't all hatch on the same day, and you may miss them. So early scouting is the main thing. If you think that you have enough grasshoppers that might warrant treatment, do that. Or if you think you have neighbors and enough land, range land, that you think it's effective to meet our program objectives, we have to plan for that early. We have to get maps together. We have to get cooperative agreements in place to make sure that we get reimbursed, because we'll pay for it all up front, but then we're reimbursed for the final cost, which is maybe $2 an acre. But there's a lot of hoops to jump through. I have a meeting soon. This may air after the meeting, but in Malta with a group there. We will be down on talking to the Crow tribe. We worked with the tribe over on the Flathead Reservation in Sanders and Lake County here recently to talk to landowners over there. So anybody that is interested, we want to talk now, not after the grasshoppers are in an adult stage. The county agent is helping us over in Sydney. There's some people interested over there. So we got a lot of little things going on, but nothing firm right now. We got to wait until we get out there and survey and make sure that there's a need. We wouldn't just treat just because this map says red. We would want to confirm that there's actually a need. And so if somebody wants us to go out and help survey, we do have some seasonal employees that'll be coming on in a couple of weeks, and call us and we'll try to work with you to try to assess your situation. So is there any other recommendations I didn't hit on there that maybe you want to know about?
Oh, we can circle back around to them. And Gary, it's oh, sorry, I got a little bit of feedback there. I can edit that. Gary, it's been a few years since I took an entomology class at Montana State. What grasshopper species have the biggest impact on rangeland health? Is it all of them, or is it a certain species that really can move in and just decimate that rangeland and hay fields and everything in its path?
Well, that's a great question. In the United States, there's actually over 400 different species of grasshoppers. In Montana, there's really only a dozen species, so 12, that really reach populations where they're impactful with the rangeland. And the primary species are in the western Montana. It's called the clear-winged grasshopper. And they're primarily over there. They're kind of in the foothills and pasture lands of the Hot Springs area and other parts of the western part of the state. And we have seen those like down by Dillon, up by Augusta, they're around, but where they're bad, they're really bad, but they're fairly localized. All that stuff that's in the eastern part of the state, I would say 80 to 90% of that is one species, and it's called the lesser migratory grasshoppers, Melanophilus sanguinipes. There is a complex of the other economic species that add to that. There's a few species that are actually beneficial. There's a snakeweed grasshopper, but they never really reach economic populations, but they're out there and they feed only on snakeweed. The big flashy ones that look like a butterfly when they're flying around, I wouldn't worry about those. They're not an economic issue. But for the most part, and this is where it makes it challenging, is that in eastern Montana, that lesser migratory grasshopper is the predominant species. And I talked to a lady at a Winifred a couple of years ago who said, I treated, and they did this on their own. We didn't do any treatments in that county at all. She said, I treated, and then a week later, I was completely infested again. And then I treated, and I was infested again. And that can happen. That's a unique situation, but the migratory grasshoppers called that for a reason. They can fly long distances. And so you don't know where they flew and laid eggs from last year. We may have counted a bunch. They may have picked up in mass and moved someplace else and dropped out of the sky and laid eggs, and we don't necessarily know where that is. The National Weather Service has actually picked up swarms of those grasshoppers on radar, and it looks like a cloud or a rain event, and it's actually grasshoppers. So it's really just a couple of species that are really, really bad, and they're really kind of hard to predict.
And Gary, kind of on a different note, I mean, we've been going through drought. I mean, Phillips County, my family raises livestock up there as well. And it's been 4 or 5 years of just severe drought. And from your perspective on the plant health end of things, what are some things producers should be aware of and watching for rangeland health as we see drought continue just to impact our grasses, invasive species, our soil moisture? What are some conversations you have there? Maybe resources you can point a producer just to be aware of just how drought is just not impacting growth of our grasses, but just other issues that might pop up along the way.
My specialty is pretty restricted to the grasshoppers, unfortunately, so I don't have a lot of information for you But you said two things that I do want to address. One is invasive species, which is really what my agency primarily works with, and I would love to talk about that in detail too. As you can tell, I don't have any problem filling time, but invasive species, things that come from another part of the world and gets established here, or trying to prevent invasive species from coming in. We want to be on an early monitoring of that, and primarily in Montana, of course, it's weeds, and we work with the weed districts and try to prevent any kind of any time that the soil is disruptive or the rangeland's disruptive, that kind of creates an environment for these invasive plants to get introduced. So that's maybe a whole different discussion. But if you want to talk about rangeland health, I guess I would probably just have to refer you to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS. I think they're probably better suited to providing a lot of that information on how to manage your grazing habits. And it's been tough. I didn't realize you were from Phillips County, but I saw that a couple of years ago where it ate all the shelter belts that the grasshoppers ate. I don't know if it killed them or not. I haven't been back up there. I'll be up there tomorrow, but yeah, they were hugely impactful, and grasshoppers is just one part of that. You need moisture. Hopefully, and here I'm just saying hopefully that the productivity of the rangeland was so tough, and I apologize in advance for saying it this way, but it was so tough on the ranchers that it was hopefully very difficult for the grasshoppers too. If they didn't get the proper nutrition, it's possible that their populations will also decline along with with other things on the environment out there. So that's my hope. But as far as rangeland management, that's not my forte. I'd have to refer you to one of my sister agencies on that one for some better advice, or MSU has some good people that help you with that.
No doubt. A lot of good protein was in some of that hay, though, with how many grasshoppers probably got bailed up across the country there, Gary, as well. That was a joke we all had. That was probably about the only protein that we were able, if we were able to put a hay crop up last year.
Yeah, you didn't have to add any meat meal to it, did you?
No. We did see on that graph you shared as well, parts of Wyoming there and into Idaho. What is the state in predictions for grasshopper infestations in our surrounding states? And maybe we could focus on Wyoming if you have that information handy, or your colleagues there. What could our producers in the surrounding states around Montana expect to see this year, if you have that information available?
Well, I do. I'm in pretty close contact with my Wyoming counterpart down there, and they don't expect to do any USDA treatments. There might be some isolated treatments down there, and he expects to do very little. And Wyoming is kind of a different situation in Montana. We have county weed districts in Montana. They have county weed and pest districts, and the counties actually work very closely to manage some of these larger treatment areas, in addition to the USDA program. So it's a little broader of a application of grasshopper suppression in Wyoming than we have in Montana. We're kind of a one-stop shop for us, and so Wyoming says they don't expect to do any treatment. So I've already asked them. I said, if we get into treatments this year, you're going to come help. I don't know if we'll get them to come up and help us or not. But as you can see, the Dakotas in the past have not had significant populations, but they had some pretty significant populations this last year. So it's starting to move over into that area. And as far as Idaho goes, they had some small grasshopper treatments down there, but I don't know if you read about in the news what Idaho and Nevada and even into Utah and Washington, and occasionally their issue, other than grasshoppers, is actually Mormon crickets, which is part of our program, but they're kind of a different critter, and they're really big as my thumb, and march in bands across roads and into towns, and they sometimes make the news, but they kind of have a different issue other than grasshoppers. It seems like Montana's kind of the worst spot in recent years, but we're sharing some of that love with the Dakotas here. You can see it's moving over there.
Well, again, as you mentioned, Gary, for producers just to be on the outlook for scouting in their own pastures and fields into May, into June. We'll cross our fingers this moisture keeps coming, but I don't know if that's going to happen. I really hope it does, because that would benefit our grasslands, our hay grounds, and keep our cattle out on grass a lot longer. Because that's what a lot of people that live in town don't understand is a lot of producers, they had to ship early, they had to liquidate their herds, and like Marco Manukian's prediction up there in Phillips County, 50% of that herd went down the road. That is the lifeline of that community is agriculture. Uh, Gary, any last thoughts that you would just like to share with our listeners and our viewers here today? Obviously, we're expecting grasshoppers again, as you mentioned, this year. But any last thoughts, recommendations? Of course, your information is there on the screen for our audience that's watching this on YouTube or Facebook. I'll let you have the floor.
Well, I would just say, if you think that our program, as I described it, could be a benefit to you, is to call me yesterday, and let's have a conversation about it. And both my cell phone number and my landline are there. I have a very small staff. I only have 3 professionals and a technician, and then some of our seasonal employees, in conjunction with a number of other programs that we do. And so I need to hear from you early. It takes quite a bit to put a program together. If you have aerial contractors in your neck of the woods, start talking to them. They have products that they use that we don't have available to us to the USDA. You can talk to them, see if they could do some work for you. Those of you that have crops, a lot of times that's the issue, is that the grasshoppers will move from the adjacent rangeland into your cropland and significantly impact that crop production. So I would say you might be out scouting or paying a crop consultant to look at your crop, but go look adjacent to it on the rangeland and monitor what's going on there, and maybe do some reduced agent area treatments, out in the rangeland to keep them from moving on your crops, and that'll help a little bit. And if you have no-till settings, I think sometimes in the past where grasshoppers didn't emerge in tilled situations, the no-till settings now that they're emerging right in the middle of some cropping fields. So be monitoring real early. Talk to your local contractors about treatment, and give me a ring. And if there's some areas that we can, if we have somebody available and you want us to come out and do some assessment of some surveys, call early in June, and we'll try to get somebody out there to take a look at it. I guess that's about my last line there. This is we have limited funding, so the first come first served as far as whoever's got their ducks in a row and have a need, or who we're going to be able to help this year. And it takes a lot kind of to pull it together.
Well, again, for all of the folks that I talk with in other parts of the nation, I always describe it, the scenes that I've seen in Petroleum County, Phillips County, and in Choteau County last year. I know a lot of producers around Big Sandy really got wiped out on rangeland and their crops as well. It's almost like the book of Exodus. I think that the 8th plague, I know those were locusts, but the grasshoppers, of course, it just gives you the creepy crawlies when you see that many grasshoppers per square foot and crawling on the buildings, and just looks like an ocean wave. And that's what so many producers have seen. And we saw those on those maps. But Gary, I appreciate you sharing these predictions, because again, I hope our predictions are wrong. we always want the bad news to be wrong, but they are predictions.
Yeah. They're just a best guess at this point, and we also hope that they decline, and they will decline at some point. And it could be this year, but it may be we may be in it for another year or two. We'll see. Yeah, I forgot about that Big Sandy area. We've had some calls from some landowners over there, so we'll be over there doing some work for sure.
Yep. Well, again, Gary Adams, safe travels as you go meet with producers here this week, and we'll flash that up on our screen. Again, for our listeners, I'll have this contact information in the podcast description below with links to information to Gary and his team. But for our viewers on our social media platforms, reach out to Gary Adams and his team there with USDA APHIS here in Montana. Or if you're viewing this from out of state in Wyoming or the surrounding regions or across the West, contact your local state officials with USDA APHIS with any of those questions. Gary, I do appreciate you taking your time here today. Again, producers have been impacted by these by these critters for the last few years. And hopefully, like we said, the predictions are wrong, but we just want producers to be aware of what could possibly be coming down the road. Even though we have that cold winter, you mentioned we had that insulation on the ground, and yeah, we've had a good spring here, but we can't let our guard down.
Thanks for everything you do to get the word out. So appreciate it.
Well, friends, that will do it for this agriculture conversation here on the Lanecast Ag Podcast in conjunction with, of course, the Western Ag Network. I'm Lane Nordlund. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Lanecast with Talkin' Ag, Lane Nordlund. For more on Lane, check out his Facebook page, Lane Nordlund Ag Broadcaster, and NordlandCommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lanecast on your Apple or Android devices. We look forward to joining you next time on the Lanecast.